Sorry. Take your time. Go past 10 minutes. I'll let you know.
Welcome to Progressive Short Takes. I'm Joe Firestone, your host, and the topic for this video is the return of the movement toward socialism. Of course, I'm talking about the latest election in Bolivia. And I'm going to go through and comment on a great piece by Glenn Greenwald on the results of the election. So hang on a second. I'm going to share the screen so you can see the article. Entitled Bolivians Return Evo Morales' Party to Power. 1 year after a U.S. applauded coup. In November 2019, Bolivia's three-term president, Evo Morales, was forced under threat of police and military violence to flee to Mexico. Just weeks after he was declared the winner of the October presidential election that would have sent him to his fourth term. Installed in his place was an unelected right-wing coup regime led by self-declared interim president, quote-unquote, Yanin Áñez, who promptly presided over a military massacre that killed dozens of Evo's indigenous supporters and then granted immunity to all the soldiers involved. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at the time cheered the coup by citing subsequently debunked claims of election fraud by the Organization of American States, or OAS, and urging, quote, a truly democratic process by representative of the people's will, unquote. But after the Áñez regime twice postponed and scheduled elections this year, the Bolivians went to the polls on Sunday. They delivered a resounding victory to presidential candidate Luis Arce, who's Evo Morales' former finance minister, and the candidate from his movement towards socialism, or MAS party. Although official results are still being counted, exit polls from firms that are very reputable show Arce with a blowout victory, over 50%. I think it was actually 52.1 or 4 or something like that, against centrist former president and a far-right coup leader, and Áñez herself conceded that MAS has won. We do not yet have an official count, but from the data we have, Mr. Arce and MAS, the vice presidential candidate, but Mr. Choquehuanca have won the election. I congratulate the winners and ask them to govern with Bolivia and democracy in mind. And here is a picture of the Bolivians holding their hands high, their clasped hands high in triumph, and looking very happy. Of course, in the center, is Arce, the presidential candidate of the movement towards socialism, or MAS, and his running mate, who is David Choquehuanca, who was second from the right, and they celebrate during a press conference where they claim victory after the elections in La Paz, Bolivia on October 19th. It is difficult to remember the last time a U.S. approved coup in Latin America failed so spectacularly. Even with U.S. Dominated OAS's instantly dubious claims of electoral fraud, nobody disputed that Evo Morales received more votes in last October's election than all other candidates. The only question raised by the OAS was whether his margin of victory was sufficient to win on the first round and avoid a runoff. Despite his win, the Bolivian police and then military made clear to Morales that neither he nor his family nor his closest allies would be safe unless he immediately left the country, as he detailed in an interview that Glenn Greenwald conducted with him just weeks after he was driven into exile in Mexico City. In that interview, Morales blamed not only the U.S. for giving the green light to the right-wing coup leaders, but also attributed the coup to Western anger over his decision to sell some of the country's valuable lithium supply to China rather than to the West. So this is very classic imperialism, trying to loot another country's mineral wealth for the sake of your own country. After 12 years in office, Morales was not free of controversy or critics. As the first elected indigenous leader of the country, even some of his core supporters grew wary of what they regarded as his growing reliance on quasi-autocratic tactics in order to govern. Several of his most prominent supporters, both within Bolivia and in South America, were critical of his decision to secure judicial permission to seek a fourth term, despite a constitutional term limits provision of 2 terms. So he'd even gotten a third term, and then he wanted to secure permission for a fourth term. Even Morales' long-term, close Brazilian ally, former President Lula da Silva, who correctly predicted in a 2019 interview with me that, quote, "You can be certain that if Evo Morales runs for president, he'll win." He nonetheless, however, said that Evo's pursuit of a fourth term was a mistake. None of those criticisms changed the central, unavoidable fact. More Bolivians voted for Morales to be their president in 2019 than any other candidate. And in a democracy, that is supposed to be decisive. For those purporting to believe in democracy, that should be the end of the matter. That's why Lula, in his Guardian interview shortly after the coup, where he criticized the bid for a fourth term, nonetheless emphasized the far more important point, quote, "What they did with him was a crime. It was a coup. This is terrible for Latin America," unquote. And whatever critics one is able to legitimately voice about Evo Morales, it is hard to imagine any leader ruling for more than a decade without alienating some supporters and making mistakes. There is no question that the presidency gave Evo Morales, by almost every metric, was a success. After decades of instability in the country, he ushered in a stable and thriving democracy, says Glenn Greenwald, presided over economic growth that even Western financial institutions praised, and worked to ensure a far more equitable distribution of those resources than ever before, particularly to the country's long-oppressed indigenous minority and its rural farmers. That success is what was destroyed on purpose when the Bolivian presidency was decided in 2019, not democratically, but by force. The reaction by the West, I think what we should say more is the reaction by the United States. The 2019 Bolivian coup featured all of its classic propaganda tropes. Western officials, media outlets, and think tank writers invoked the standard Orwellian inversion of heralding a coup of any democratically elected leader they do not like as, quote, uh, 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 as a, quote, victory for democracy, unquote. In this warped formula, it is not the U.S. supported coup plotters, but the overthrown democratically elected leader who is the, quote, threat to democracy, unquote. Depicting U.S. supported coups as democratic and democratically elected leaders disliked by the U.S. as, quote, dictators, unquote, has been a staple of U.S. foreign policy propaganda for decades. That is the rubric under which the Obama administration and Secretary of State John Kerry somehow celebrated one of the world's worst despots, Egyptian General El-Sisi, as, quote, restoring democracy, unquote, following the brutal military coup he carried out. But thanks to Sunday's stunning rebuke uh, 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 in Bolivia, the standard tactics failed. Ever since Morales' election victory almost exactly 1 year ago, Bolivians never stopped marching, protesting, risking their liberty and their lives, even in the middle of a pandemic. And by the way, the rate of death in Bolivia per million is among the highest in the world right now, is greater than the United States even. So they have risked their liberty and their lives, even in the middle of a pandemic, to demand their rights of democracy and self-governance. Leading up to the election, the coup regime and right-wing factions in the military were menacingly vowing, in response to polls that were universally showing that Mas was likely to win, that they would do anything to prevent the return to power of Evo's party. At least as of now, though, it looks as though the margin of victory delivered to Mas by the Bolivian people was so stunning, so decisive, that there are few options left for the retrograde forces in Bolivia, Washington, and Brussels, which tried to destroy the country's democracy. In other words, he's saying here, the EU was also favorable to the coup, which they were, by the way. Anyone who believes in the fundamentals of democracy, regardless of ideology, should be cheering the Bolivians who sacrificed so much to restore their right of self-rule, and hoping that the stability and prosperity they enjoyed under Morales expands even further under his first democratically elected successor. So that is a wonderful development that has happened, okay, in Latin America. And a great article by Glenn reporting what has happened. I couldn't be more happy over the victory, okay, of Mas. I'm very well aware of all that Evo did for the people of that country during the time that he was president in Bolivia. And I'm hoping that his successor can do just as well and have the same kind of progress that he had after 12 years, okay, in office. Okay, because Bolivia really needs it. So does Latin America. And the United States has to change its foreign policy to encourage democracy in South America and in Latin America, and to respect the sovereignty of those nations. We have to respect the sovereignty, okay, of other nations of the world if we are to be a truly democratic nation ourselves. So on that note, I'm going to end this short take. Thank you very much for coming, and I'll see you again soon.